Now let's take a look at the project that we'll be making. So this is the quiz application that we'll be making with the help of React, and it is going to enable our users to select the number of questions that they want, as well as the category of questions that they would like to select. Apart from it, the difficulty level that the question should possess, easy, medium, or difficult. So select on easy for now and click on start. Now this is going to show up a loading screen, and once we get our questions with 4 options, one can select any option, and if they are true, that means if the questions are correct, then we are going to get our answers in a correct answer, that this number of questions have been done correct by you. Now apart from it, once all of our questions are done, that means all the specified number of questions, for example 15 in this case, are complete, we are going to get up a modal screen that is going to tell us the percentage of questions that we did correct. So we have answered 13% of the questions correctly. Now the database that we are using in this particular application to get our questions is the trivia database. It is a JSON free database that is going to give us our questions as well as the correct options. In this project, you'll be learning about React, how to pass data to React components which are not the direct child of the parent component, and how to manage state with React. Now, in this component, as you might have seen, that we are using modals, and for those of you who do not know what modals are, so modals are basically the visual messages that contains some vital piece of information of our state, and since they are not the direct child of a parent component, therefore we'll be using context so that we can pass data to all of the other components that are not the direct child of our parent. Now component context sits at the top level of our app. It passes data to all the other components. So now let's start so that you can have a better understanding of what we are talking about. So now we'll just start creating our application, and thanks to Facebook Create React App utility, it's fairly simple to do so. If you just visit to the GitHub repository of Create React App of Facebook, you will see a bunch of 3 commands, and these are all you need. You need to create your React app, then just move into your app and run npm start, and that is going to launch your default application. Now before we just create a React app, we need to have Node.js installed on our systems, because without it the npx command won't run. And so just download it from their official website. It's fairly simple to do so. And apart from Node.js, you also need to have a code editor. I'll be using VS Code, but feel free to use any other code editor that are out there, because all you need to do is code in that. And it is going to VS Code is free. It's an open source, and you can get the Mac OS, Windows installer, as well as the Linux installer. Now let's just create a React app, and for that purpose, just open up your command prompt or terminal. Now the first command that we need to run to create our application is npx create react app followed by the name of your app. So let's just name it npx. Now there is one npm naming convention that I would like to address, and that is you just can't have an uppercase letter in the name of your app. Your app name should be in all lowercase. So let's just name it Breaking Bad. So this is going to be the name of our application, and now hit enter. Now it is going to take some time to create your React application, and by the time it does, you have to wait. Now we'll be defining the folder structure of our application. So head to your source file and create a folder with the name modal. And inside this modal, make another file with the name modal.jsx. Now this is one of the part of our application. Now apart from this, we'll be making another folder. So make another folder with the name context. And inside this, make another file with the name context.jsx. Right, so these are the 2 components. Now after this, we'll be creating another folder with the name form. And inside this, make another file with the name setupform.jsx. Now we have 3 components inside our source directory, and those are context, form, as well as our modals. Now we even want a loading screen in our application. So inside a source directory, make another folder with the name loading. And inside this, make another file, loading screen .jsx. So right, this is the folder structure of our application, and we'll be starting with it now. Step is to create our first setup form.jsx and close off all the other components of your app. Now for this application, we won't be writing CSS. I have already provided you with the code of CSS, so I want you to go over here and copy this entire code and then head to your index.css and paste it over here. And since this is an application that requires a lot of CSS, therefore we won't be actually writing CSS manually. I have provided with the code, so just come over here and paste it. And since this is React, I feel like as if you must be quite familiar with CSS. So now head to your setup form, and the first thing that we'll do over here is create a form. So create a constant and name it setup form. And this is going to be an arrow function. Now put up a return statement, and inside this return statement we're going to have a main as a parent class. So create main and a closing main. Now inside this main we are going to have a section, so let's create a section now and give it a class name of equal to quiz small. Alright, so this is a section. Now close this, and inside the section we are going to have another property or another field of form. So let's create a form element now. Now this form is going to have a class name of setup form, so give it a class name of equals to setup form. Now close this. Now this form is going to contain a h2 tag, so give it a h2 tag, and inside it put up setup quiz. Let me close this so it can be visible. Alright, so here is our setup form, and inside it we have a h2 tag with setup quiz in it. Now right beneath our h2 tag create a div and give it a class name of form control. Now close this div, and this div is going to contain a label, so give it a label and a property HTML4, which is going to be equal to amount. Alright, so here is our HTML4 amount. Now close this and put up number of questions inside the our labels. Alright, so right beneath our label we are going to have our input field, so let's create our input field now and give this input field a type of numbers. So this is going to be of type numbers. So basically this input field is to define how many questions does our user want in their application. So give it a field of number, type of number I mean, and after the number give it a name of submit. So name should be equal to amount, as well as the ID is going to follow the same, so give it also amount. Alright, so we have our input field with the type number, name amount, as well as our ID amount. Now after this give it a class name which is going to be equal to form input. Alright, now close this input field with a self-closing tag. So this is our first input field. Now we'll be creating a second input field, and this too would be having a div of itself. So give it a div and a class name of equals to form control, and this as well is going to have a label inside it, so give it a label and an HTML4 property, and this time it is going to hold the value of category. And now close this, and inside the label write category. So this is a category. Now come beneath our label and now create an input field, and this is going to contain the category of question that our users want. So this is going to, rather than having an input field, it is going to have a select field that our user is able to select what kind of questions they want, whether they want the political questions or the historic questions or the sports questions. So now this select is going to have a name, so give it a name of equals to category, as well as ID that is going to be equal to category. Now close this and give this even a class name that is going to be equal to form input. Alright, so this select field is going to have some options, right? So let's create some options for it. Now this option is going to hold up a value. So this value is going to be sports, as well as inside our options where we will be having sports. Now we are having 3 options inside our application. So let's just copy this and paste it again and again. And after sports, we'll be having another field, or I must say another genre of questions. So history, as well as history again. And after history, we're going to have a political questions. So now politics, as well as politics over here. Alright, so here we are having our 3 options, as well as our div is being closed here over here. Now after this div, we are going to have another div. So let's create another div. And this div is going to be for difficulty level. What sort of questions our users want, whether they should be easy or difficult or medium. So give this div a class name of form control as usual. And now close this div, and this again is going to have a label. So give this a label, and this time the label is going to have a HTML for, which is going to be equal to difficulty. Alright, so now the closed label, and this is going to have difficulty in it. Alright, so beneath our label we are going to have another input field. So create another select field now, and this select field is going to have a name that is going to have a name as difficulty. So give this difficulty, as well as an ID of difficulty. Alright, so in the select we are having our name as well as our ID and a class name of form input. Alright, so now just close this, and inside our select we're going to have our 3 options. Now let me just copy this and paste it again 3 times, because the number of options that we have are easy, medium and hard. So easy, those questions that are easy peasy, and then the medium ones, and then the really difficult ones. Easy, medium, as well as difficult. Alright, so here we are having our 3 inputs. Now right beneath this we are going to have another paragraph element. So right outside of our div we are going to create a paragraph element. So this paragraph element is going to have a class name of error. At the moment we are displaying all that we have in our application, but as we progress forward and when we text.jx, then is a point of time when we will be conditionally rendering the statements such as p as well as errors, whether they are appearing or not, and some. Now inside this p we are going to have can't generate questions. Please try again. So here is a paragraph element. So right beneath a paragraph element we're going to have another button state, create a button element, and that too should be inside of our form. So now this button statement is going to have a type of submit. Alright, so here with the type submit, class name, which is going to be equal to submit button. Alright, so here is a button. Now let's just close this, and this is going to have start as a text between them. Now hit save. Now we have configured our setup form, but we need to export it, right? So let's just export it. Export. Export defaults, setup form. Alright, so now we're exporting it as well. Now let's just call this form inside of our app.jsx. So move into app.jsx, and inside this, let's create a functional component. So create a function app, and this is going to have a return statement, and this return statement is going to be having a parent class. So let's just create a parent class. Alright, so now inside this we'll be calling up our setup form. So let's call it. So here we have even imported our setup form, and seems like my auto import of VS Code is working. So here is a setup form, and if you like to manually import it, then just write setup form from your form folder. Inside the form folder, you'll be having your forms.jsx. So here's my forms.jsx, so I can import it manually, but for me it has been done by my auto import. So let's just leave it like this. Now we'll be exporting our function app. So let's export it. Alright, so here we are having our setup form. So now we'll be configuring our models.jsx. So head to your models.jsx and create up a functional component. So const model, and this model is again going to be an arrow function. Now put up a return statement, and inside this return statement we're going to have a parent container dev. So let's create a dev, and for now just give it a class name of equals to model container is open. So give it a class name, model container is open. So now conditionally we'll be assigning it the class name, and you will soon figure out what I'm talking about. But for now, let's just leave it like this, where the div has a class name of model container is open. And after this, we'll be creating another div. So we'll create another div and give this a class name of model content. So give this a class name of equals to model content. Alright, so here is a class name of model content. Now close this. Now inside this we'll be having a h2 tag. So create a h2 tag with the text congrats. And this is going to congratulate our user that yes, you have answered the particular question correctly. Now after this, we are going to have a paragraph element. So create a paragraph tag. And inside this paragraph tag, we are going to give the statistics to our users that you have done this much questions correctly. So you answered n questions correctly. As for now, we are not having any state, so we are assigning it any sorts of random value, but once we configure our state inside the application, we'll be coming up and changing it to the dynamic values. But for now, let's just leave it like some lorem ipsum. So you have answered all the questions correctly. Alright, so here is a paragraph element. Now right beneath a paragraph element, we're going to have a button. So let's create a button now. And this button is going to speak up, is going to have a class name of close button. Alright, so and this is also going to have on-click property, but we'll be adding it that property later on. So now let's close this, and this is going to have a text in between that is going to say play again. Alright, so this is all about our model. Now let's export our model. So export model. So we are exporting our model as well. Now let's close this. So we have configured our app. We have configured our setup form.jsx as well as our models.jsx. Now what remains is our loading screen. So next we'll be configuring our loading screen. So head to loading screen.jsx and close off all the other tabs. and close this as well. Now let's create a functional component, and this is going to be an arrow component, arrow function I mean. So const loading and arrow function. Now this is going to have a return statement, and this return statement we're going to have a parent div. So create a parent div, and this div, let's just make it a main, not a div. And this main is going to have a div that is going to be of class name equals to loading. Now close this. So this is our component. Now let's export our component. So export default, okay. Export default loading. Alright, so we have configured all the components that we have except for our context.js that is going to be supplier or provider of the data to all of these components. So that is next on our list. But before we do that, let's call all of these components inside our app.jsx and see how they actually look with the CSS that we have applied to them. So apart from setup form, we'll be also calling our modal. So let's call our modal. And after this modal, we'll also be calling up our loading screen. So call our loading. Alright, so we also need to import our modal. So alright, we have all the components that we need. Now I just need to put up a closing tag or set closing tag on my loading. Alright, so we are all set and ready to roll. Now let's just fire up our terminal and see how our application looks. Now let's take a look at our application. So if I just head to my application, I see, okay, so modal is not having some correct CSS applied to it. And why is that? If we just head back into our code editor and open up our modals module, so here's a modal. Okay, so it should be a lowercase m and content. Now hit save and it should hopefully display the kind of UI that we want. And let's see if everything has compiled successfully. And yeah, indeed it is. Now if we just head back, alright, so this is our modal that is going to appear. And at present I haven't added any on-click properties on it, so therefore it won't be working. So we'll have to manually remove our modal from our app.js. So get rid of this modal and hit save, and let's view our app. So this is the app that we are making. This is the number of questions that we want, which can exceed up to maximum 50. And it is exceeding more than this, and that's because we haven't supplied any maximum and minimum property to it. So if we just take a look at our amount, our first input, which is having amount, so let's supply it with a minimum and maximum. So minimum is going to be equal to 1 and maximum is going to be equal to 50. At max we want 50 questions, and at least we want only one question in our application. Now hit save and view our application. Alright, if I now would like to go beyond 50, so we won't be able to, and I just can't go beyond 1. Yeah, and that's working. And here we are having our category, our sports, our history, as well as our politics. And here is the difficulty level. Alright, so we are having our number of questions, we are having a category and a difficulty level. Alright, so this is our application. Now this is just a form that is going to appear at the start of our screen or at the start of our app, right? And after this there are supposed to be questions coming up. So now let's just code them. So head back into your app.js and get rid of all of them because they would be conditionally rendered. Now we'll be designing up our application, and our app is going to be, and our app2 is going to have a main container. So let's create a main container. We create a main and a closing main. Now inside this main we are going to have a section. So let's create a section, and this section is going to have a class name. So give this section a class name as well, and this section is going to have a class name of equals to quiz. So previously we had a setup form that is going to set up or get the data from a user that what sorts of questions do they want in the application. And next we are creating is that the number of questions that are to be displayed to a user. So this is a boilerplate of our question paper. So this section is going to have a class name of quiz. Now close this. Now inside this section, we're going to have a paragraph tag. So create a paragraph, and this paragraph is going to hold up a class name of correct answers. So give this a class name of equals to correct answers. Now close this, and this is going to specify the number of correct answers that our user has given. So correct answers equals to, suppose, 3 this time. Now after this, what we're going to do is that we'll be creating an article. So now let's create an article, and this article is going to have a class name of container. So give this article a class name of equals to container. Alright, so here is a container. Now close this, and inside the article we're going to have a h2 tag. So create a h2 tag, and this is going to contain just text as a lorem ipsum text. Now after this h2, we are going to create a div which is going to contain nothing at the moment. So let's create a div and give this a class name of equals to button container. Alright, now let's close this div, and just beneath our div we are going to close off our article, and right beneath the article we are going to create a button. So let's create a button, and this button is going to have a class name of equals to next question. Alright, so we have a next question over here. Now this is going to hold the text next question. Alright, so we are all set. Now let's take a look at our app now. So this is the question paper, or the questions that our user will be getting on. So now it's time to create a context.js so that we can get our questions dynamically. So now let's create a context.js. Now move into a context.jsx, and now we'll be configuring our context.jsx, and since this is the provider component, that means that it is providing data to all of our application and is sitting at the top level. Therefore we'll be naming it const app provider. Alright, so here is our app provider. Now this is an arrow function. Now let us decide what all we want in our state. So the first piece of state that we want is going to be for our waiting. That means when we are waiting for our user to select what kind of questions that they want. And apart from waiting, we'll also be needing loading when our app is loading. So this is going to hold up a state when our app is getting loaded into our browsers. And apart from this, we'll be needing another state for questions that is going to hold the number of questions or the array of questions. And after the questions, we'll also be needing index. That is going to, apart from index, we'll be needing another state that is going to help us to count the number of correct questions that we have done. Apart from it, we'll also be needing an error state that is going to define how much error have we caused, or if there has been any sorts of error when we were loading in our application. Now apart from this, the last piece of state that we want is going to be the quiz state. So now this is going to hold up an object, and the quiz state is going to define what all our users have selected. For example, whether they want the question numbers to be from 1 to 10, or they want the questions to be 20 or 30, or what kind of category of questions that they want. Apart from it, what is the difficulty level that they have chosen. So for all this, we'll be using our useState hook. So let's import our useState hook from React module. Alright, and if you're wondering why in the entire application I haven't imported React once in application, well, that's because since the introduction of ES16, we are in no longer requirement to import React manually. It has already been done for us. So now let's start using our states. So for that purpose, now let's create a const, and this is going to hold up the state for whether we are waiting or not. So waiting, and the setter function for this, that is going to be equal to set waiting. So set waiting. which is going to be initially equal to true. That means we're going to assume that user hasn't entered any sorts of data into our application. So let's just put it up to true. Now after this waiting, we're going to have another piece of state that is going to be for loading, whether app has loaded into the browser or not. So const loading, and a setter function for this, set loading, which is going to be initially false. So use state false. All right, so we have two pieces of state now. Now is going to be another piece of state that is going to be for our questions. So const questions, and the setter function for this that is going to be called as set questions. And initially it is going to be an empty array because we haven't gotten any sorts of question into our application now. So put it up to empty array. Now after this, we are going to create another constant or another function for this that is going to be for index. So let's create an index state. So index, and a function to set this that is going to be called as set index. And this is going to have an initial value of 0. So give it use state an initial value of 0. After this, we're going to create another piece of state that is going to be for the correct questions that we have done. So correct and set correct, and this is going to be equal to use state, and initial value is again going to be 0. So put up 0 in this. Now after this, we're going to deal with the errors if there were any sorts of errors while loading the question. Error, set error, and initially this is going to be equal to false. Alright, so here are all the pieces of state. Apart from this, the last piece of state that we want to configure is the quiz. So const quiz and set quiz. Now there's a default value that we'll be giving to our quiz. So use state will assume that our user wants create an object inside it. Now the field of properties as a default argument that we're passing up are the amount. We will assume that our user wants 10 questions. Apart from it, we'll also assume that the category that our user has selected is of sports, and the difficulty level that they have chosen is easy. Alright, so this is the default quiz that we are saving now. Now let's hit save. So these are all the pieces of state that we want in our application. Now apart from it, we'll be creating functions so that we can fetch data into our UI. Let's take a look at our API from where we are getting our data. So now let us take a look at the API that we are using to get our data. So Trivia API is the one that we are using to fetch our data. I mean the questions that we are getting as well as the correct answers. And we can define the number of questions that we want. We can select the category of questions. We can select the difficulty level, what type of questions they should be. And if I just click on generate API URL, this is going to generate on which you're supposed to make a call. So let's just copy this and start creating our fetch method so that we can get our data. Now close this, head to your code terminal, and now we'll be creating a fetch method so that we can get our data from our API. The last piece of state that we want in our application, and that is going to be for our modals. So this is going to be for our modals that is going to define whether our modal is open or closed. So const modal set modal is going to be equal to use state, and initially it is going to be equal to false. Alright, so here we are having our models. Okay, let's get rid of them. Now we'll be setting up our context.js before we add any fetch method to it. So let's set up our context.js for that purpose, and we'll be creating our context. So right above your app.provider, create a const app context, which is going to be equal to react.createContext, Alright, so here is our context is being created. Now hit save. Now come down beneath your constants or states and give it a return statement. Now inside this return statement, we are going to define the data that we want to send outside. And now inside this return statement, we are going to have our app context provider. So app context dot provider. Now close this. Now inside this is going to be the children. So give it children. Alright, so now this app context is going to hold up different values. Now we even need to export this, right? So now let's export. So export const use global context which again is an arrow function. And this is going to return use context equals to app context. Alright, so we need to import our use context as well from our React module. Now we'll also be needing to export our app context as well as our app provider. So let's export our app context as well as our app provider. Alright, so we are in requirement to import use context from React. So let's import our use context. Now before we move to create our fetch method, let's just remove this React. So there are basically two ways to solve this. Either can have this react.createConstant context and import React from here. The other way around is that I'll just remove this React as well as this react.createContext. I'll remove this React and just import create context from React. So anyway, it's fine, you can choose any one of the methods. So app equals to create context, and we are importing our use state, our use context as well as our create context. And apart from it, we are will also be destructuring our children. So right inside these braces, just call in your children. Alright, so we are now, and our boilerplate is ready. So right above your return statement inside your app, we'll be creating a fetch methods so that we can get our data from our API. So let's create a fetch method. Now let's create the method that is going to fetch our data from our API. So right beneath our constants, we'll be creating a fetch method that is going to fetch our questions. So let's create a method. So this is the name of the method that we'll be creating. Now since we are using an API call in this, that means we need to get data. Therefore, we are in requirement to use the await keyword, for which we'll have to use the async function. So this is going to be an async function. Now let's import our Axios because we'll be needing it. So if I just head upwards, so it has already been imported for me. So all you have to do is just that we'll have to import Axios from Axios. So alright, it's done now. Now what you're going to do is that we'll be creating a constant. So let's create a const, and the name of this constant is going to be response. So this constant is going to be response, that is going to be equal to await, because we want to tell that, hey, wait for this promise to resolve. Once we are done getting our data, then you can move forward. So now we will be pasting our data that we got from our API. So this is the temporary API call that we're making. Now if some sort of error occurs, then for that we'll be creating a catch statement, and if anything's fallback, then just report an error. And all I want you to do is just console log this error. Alright, so this is our API call. Now after this, what we're going to do is that we'll be creating a submit button that is going to be passed to our setup form. But before we do that, let me just... Now we're going to set up our different states. So right after our response, if our response has been true, if we have got some data, then we'll be checking that if response is true. And if it is true, then what I want is that we will be creating a const data, which is going to be equal to response dot data dot results Alright, so this is the data that we're getting from our results, response. Now after this, after this happens, we'll be declaring an if statement, and if data dot length, that means if we have some data inside our data constant, then what we want to do is that then we want to set our questions. Then set questions equals to the data that we have gotten. So we'll be setting up our questions, which initially is an empty array, but once we have gotten our data, we'll be setting up our questions. Now after we have set up our questions, what we're going to do is that we'll make sure that our loading is false. That means we have gotten our data from our API, so set loading to false, as well as set waiting to false. And after set loading and set waiting, we'll be also be setting our error to false, because there was no error inside our application. So set error to equals to false. Alright, so we have set up these three pieces of state, and else if this happens, then we want to do this. And if our data dot length is 0, that means if our data dot length is not true, then what do you want to do? Then we want to make sure that our set waiting is true, as well as a set loading is true. Alright, so if our data dot length is true, then we want to set questions to that data. We want to set loading to false, we want to set waiting to false, we want to set error to false. And if our data dot length is 0, then we want to set waiting to true, as well as set dot loading to true. Now if our response is false, now this and this if are actually nested under this particular if, this parent if. Now if our parent if is false, then what do you want to do? Then else what you want to put up is that set waiting to true. Alright, now apart from this, at the starting of a function, right above our const response, we'll make sure that our set loading is true, because we haven't actually fetched any sorts of data yet. Apart from set loading, we'll also be putting set waiting to false. So set waiting to false, because at this point of time we are waiting for our data to be fetched, but our application is ready. Alright, so we have set up our fetch function. Now we need to call this function, and for which we'll be creating another method inside our context.jsx. Now we'll be creating another method inside our function that is going to help us to submit our data, and that function is going to be passed to our app.jsx so that we can start our quiz. So let's create a handle method. So right beneath our fetch method, we'll be creating a const handle submit. Now this is going to be an arrow function that is going to take an event as an argument. Now since this is a submit method, we'll make sure that whenever this function is called, our browser doesn't reload itself. So e.prevent default. Alright, so we have saved it from refreshment. Now apart from it, we'll make sure that we'll be creating a constant, and this constant is going to be called as URL. So basically this is the URL we want our fetch method to go to, and this is going to be a template string because we'll be adding different variables to it. So put a backtext and paste the statement that has been provided to you inside of your documents. Now if you're wondering what these amount, difficulty as well as category are, so if you might recall that when we made our state, our quiz state, we already provided it with a default amount, a default category and a default difficulty. And as for the table, we'll be creating a table now. So const table, so basically table is a reference value that is going to define various number points for various strings. For example, our sports has the point of 19, whereas our history has point of 23, and our politics holds the point of 24. So we have made a table as well. Now we need to destructure our amount difficulty as well as our amount difficulty and a category. So let's destructure them from our quiz. So right beneath our event.prevent default, create a const that is going to have the value amount as well as difficulty as well as our category. Now this all is initialized to quiz, so we are destructuring our data from our quiz. So now we have fetched our URL. Now we need to post a request to our fetch URL so that we can get our data. So fetch questions, and this is going to have URL as a parameter. Now we need to make sure that our fetch questions also takes up a URL. Now apart from this URL, we'll be giving it the URL that we are getting from our submit method. So URL. Alright, so now we have successfully created a fetch method as well as a handle submit method. Now we are going to create two other methods. One is going to be for opening our modules as well as closing our modules. So right beneath our or right above your handle submit, let's create a const, and this is going to be for opening our module. So open module. Now this again is an arrow function. Now if one clicks on open module, what you want to do that is that set module to true. That means set the module value equals to true. That means our module is open. Now apart from it, we'll be creating another method that is going to close our module. So close module. This again is an arrow function, and it will make sure that our set module is turned to false. That means switches are flipped now, and after setting it to false, we'll make sure that set waiting as well is true, and apart from set waiting, set correct is 0. That means we have refreshed our state of the number of questions that are correct. So we have made these two methods. Now we have our handle submit, our open method, our close module method as well as our fetch method. Now apart from this, we'll be having two other methods, and if we just go upside, we will be also having methods to set our index as well as set correct, that the number of questions that are correct in our answers. Now just beneath your close module, we'll be making these two methods. Now we'll be setting our another method, that is the next question method, which is going to handle our data of set index and opening our module. So const next question. So as the name suggests, the name is self-explanatory, that it is going to be called on every next question, and this again is going to be an arrow function, and it is going to set our index, right, and this is going to take up old index as a parameter. So basically it's taking up a previous value, and this is going to make sure that our index, let's create a const index that is going to be equal to our old index plus 1. So we are incrementing the old value by 1 now. So now if our index is greater than our old index dot length minus 1, then we want to make sure that our module is open. So we'll be calling up our open module, and apart from open module, we'll be returning 0. Alright, and if not, then we want to just return our index. That means our questions are not still finished. We want to attempt more questions. Return index. Alright, so we have set it up our next question. Now the last method that we need to set up is to check our answers whether they are right or not. So now we'll be configuring our next questions. So const check answers, that is our answer checker, and it is going to take up a value that we're going to get from our app.jsx. And now if value is true, that means if our answer is correct, then we want to set correct equals to, it is going to take up a old state and add 1 to that. So old state plus 1. So now we are setting up our answers right. Now let me just get rid of this. If value alright, so now we are setting our answers. Now if our answers are correct, then we want to move on to next question. So now next question. Alright, so now we have set it up all that we need inside of our app provider. Apart from this, we are all done. Now we need to just export this data and import it into our different components and use them. Now hit save and let's do it. Now we'll be passing up all the data that we have created inside our context.js. So head into your app.provider and it is going to have a property known as value, which is going to be double equals to 2 sets of curly braces, and now we'll be passing our data. For example, waiting, as well as our loading data, as well as our questions that we have stored inside of our array. So our questions, and apart from questions, we'll make sure that we then pass up our index, and after index our correct, how many questions are correct, and our error if there are any while loading our data, and is open modal. That means if our modal is open, modal. And our next question, apart from next question, our check answers, that is going to check whether our answers are correct or not, and close modal, and quiz that we have stored, and our handle change, which we are yet to create. And after handle change, we'll passing up a handle submit. Handle submit. So we are yet to create one function. So let's just do it before we move forward. Now head up inside of a handle, just above a handle submit, and we'll be creating a handle change. So const handle. So this function is going to be there so that whenever we change our data into a setup form, that means if our user select that they do not want the questions from a sports background, they want the questions from some other field, so that we are able to set that data right. So now let's create handle change. Now this is going to be a arrow function. So let's make it an arrow function. It's going to have a constant name, which is going to be equal to e.target dot value. Apart from the name, we'll also be changing other properties. So const value, and this is going to be e.target.name, as well as e.target.value. Alright, so we are setting up our two fields, our name as well as our value. And now we will be calling our set quiz to set up the new quiz. So inside this, we'll be providing with our it with our entire array of quiz that we have. And apart from quiz, we'll also be giving it a name and new value. Name and value. So alright, we have configured all of our methods that we need to create inside our context.js. Now let's just hit save. So now we are having our parent provider that is going to provide data to all of them. But now we are in requirement to put it at the top, right? So for that purpose, head to your index.js. And before we head there, this is the provider that we'll be accessing inside of our index.js that is going to be acting as a pipeline to supply data to all of our other components. So head to index.js and we'll be importing our app provider. So import app provider from our context module. So it is inside our context and context.js, right? Now just beneath your react.strict mode, add your app provider and close it once your app is inside your app provider. So now this app is the children inside of our context. So if you might recall the children property over here. So at the moment, this app is acting as a children inside of our context. So all right, so we are now have set it up the pipeline. Now we need to go into all the different components and make sure that we are able to receive the data. Now there is one thing that I like you to do, and that is add a s after your questions. So just make it plural. And the reason why I'm doing this would be clear to you in just about a minute. And there are only two places where you need to just change. So question would be becoming our questions and our hit save. So this is what we are sending to our data. Now we have our senders end ready. We have set it up our senders end. Now we need to receive the data inside our app.js. So for that purpose, let's import our global context. So import use global context from our context. Alright, so we are now importing a global context. Now we need to import all the data that we need inside our app.jsx. For that purpose, we'll be refactoring those particular data that we need. So create a const inside a function app and surround it with curly braces. Now we are receiving our waiting. We are receiving our waiting as well as our loading. And after loading, we are receiving our questions, and that is an array of questions. And after questions, we are even receiving our index, and after index, we are even receiving our correct questions, correct answers, and after correct, we are receiving our next question function. So next question, all right, so after next question, we are even receiving our check answer. So check answer. All right, so that's all that we need inside our application. Now this is going to be equal to use global context. All right, so now we have structured our data, we have destructured it. Now we'll be using it inside a function. Now the first thing that we want to do is right beneath your global context, create a if statement, and that is going to check whether we are waiting or not. And if we are, then we want to show our user the setup form that they would like to select what sort of question that they want. So if waiting equals to true, then we would like to return the setup form. So let's import our setup form over here. All right, so we are having a setup form. Now after this waiting, we'll be creating another if statement, and this is going to hold the variable loading. That means if our app is in loading phase, that means our app hasn't actually acquired the data that we need. Then what do we want to do? Then we want to show the loading screen. So now if this is the case, then we want to return the loading screen. So return the loading screen. All right, so these are the first two refactors that we did. Now after this, we are in requirement to refactor our answers that we are receiving. So where are the questions? So these questions contain, so let's just take a look at our app. So now what you're seeing over on your screen is the complete app. It is not the app that we have at the current stage. So now let's select the number of questions that we want. For example, if I just want maybe 5 questions, and the category should be sports as well as the difficulty level should be easy, and I click on start. So what we'll be getting is an array of 5 questions, and each question is going to hold up a key of category and a value of sports, a correct answer, a difficulty key with the value easy or whatever you selected over there, and apart from it you'll be getting up an array of incorrect answers, as well as you'll be getting the questions. So now this is the question that we are getting up, right? So we'll be destructuring it. We'll be destructuring our question, our incorrect answers, as well as our correct answer, and that's how we're going to compare our users' answers, right? For example, the first answer in the golf, what name is given to the whole score of the 2 under par? So the correct answer is eagle. If I just click on eagle, then you might see the score is 1 out of 1. And if I just head to the second question, the correct answer is this city, and if I just select maybe Chelsea, then you will see our score is 1 out of 2 because we have answered it incorrectly. Therefore, our 1 score has not been added to our correct answers. So now let's just head back into our app, and what we'll do is that destructure our data. So we'll be destructuring our questions as well as incorrect answers as well as our correct answer. So let's destructure our incorrect answers. As well as our correct answer, as well as our question. Now if you see that this incorrect answers is a whole array of 3 numbers. So this is going to be equal to quiz, the questions, with the index that we are getting. Question number 1, 2 or 3 or 4. So we have destructured our data. We have our incorrect answers. Let me just scroll down a little bit. We have our incorrect answers as well as a correct answer and a question. Now what you're going to do is that we'll be creating a let. So let's create a let after this and give it the name answer. Now this answer is going to hold up all the values of our incorrect answer. So just use the spread operator and put up incorrect answers. So what you're doing is that we are assigning our answers all the incorrect values. So as you know that incorrect answers is actually an array of incorrect answers. Now what we're going to do is that we'll be creating up a const temp index. So now what this function is going to do, what I'm about to make, is that it is going to assign random values. So const flow and dot math dot random times 4. All right, so now we are getting our data, right? If we just take a look back into our app, so we are having all these incorrect answers as well as a correct answer. Now we need to actually shuffle them between these 4 options, right? It's not that we have to show the right answer always at the top. We are in requirement to shuffle all those answers, right? So that's what we're going to do. We'll be shuffling up our answers now. So after this, what we're going to do is that we are putting up if statement. If our temp index triple equals 3. So if our temp index equals 3, then what you're supposed to do, then we are going to answers dot push. Inside the answers, we're pushing up a correct answer. So if the temp index triple equals 3, that means we are comparing. If our temp index has generated the value of 3 using this random function, then we'll be pushing up our answers inside it. And if not, then what we're going to do is that we'll be pushing up our answers. So answers dot push answers temp index. All right, and after this, what we're going to do is that we'll be pushing up our correct answer inside of our temp index. So answers temp index is going to hold up the value of our correct answer. It should be temp index. All right, so now we are shuffling up our data. Now is the time to display or organize this data into our main function. All right, so now is the time to pour our data gracefully into our application. So for that purpose, the first refactoring that we'll do is of this correct answers. If we just take a look at our finished application, you might see that in the correct answers we have the answers we have answered correctly upon the total number of questions that we have attempted, right? So let's head back into our application, and inside this what we're going to do is that remove this hard-coded value 3, and we're going to put up curly braces correct. So this defines the correct answers times the index. So this is going to have contain our index. So let's just put up our index in here. Now hit save. Now apart from this, the next refactoring is to be done in our h2 element. So this h2 tag is going to be dangerously set in a HTML. So basically this is the question of our application. So get rid of this because it is going to be a self-closing tag. Now inside this, we're going to put up dangerously set in a HTML, and that is going to be equal to 2 sets of curly braces inside it. Now underscore underscore HTML, and this is going to contain a question. All right, so we have set it up our question as well. Now inside this div, which we left empty back at the time, we are going to map our data, and the data that we're mapping is the answers data. So answers dot map. Now this map is going to take up a single answer every time, and every time it takes up an answer as well as an index, and this is going to map it. Now every time we want to return, and inside this return we're going to put up a button element. So let's just put up a button. Now we are supposed to place this answers inside curly braces, so let's place them inside curly braces. All right, now it's fine. Now inside this return statement we are going to have a button element, so let's put up a button element. Now this button element is going to hold up a key as well as a class name, and the key is going to be our index, so let's just give it our index and give it a class name that is going to be equal to answer button. Alright, so we have a button with a key and a class name. Now after the class name we'll be giving it an onClick property, so onClick now this is going to be an arrow function again, and we are going to call out every time to check answers, so check answer. Now this is going to compare a correct answer with that of the answer that we have given. All right, so here we are checking our button element. Now right after onClick will be dangerously setting the inner HTML that is going to be equal to the answer that we have given. So again, dangerously set inner HTML that is going to have a double sets of curly braces, then the underscore underscore HTML, and that is going to be equal to the answer. All right, so now let's put our prettier to work, and seems like it isn't working, so I'll manually just return it. So our key, and next on our list is our class name and our onClick property. All right, so now is the time to close our button, right? So let's close our button with a self-closing tag. So here our button has been closed now, so it should be answer. All right, so we are fine now. Now hit save. So we have poured almost all the data that we needed in this. Now our function or this app.jsx is complete. Now let's run this application, but before we do that, I'd like to set up our modals, and I see that we have still one property that is left, and that is the next question property. So let's assign it, and this is going to be assigned to our button that is at the end. So give it an onClick property, which is going to be equal to our next question that we are getting from our context.jx. Now time to open up our modal. So let's open up our modal now. Now we'll be setting up our modals.jsx, and for that purpose let's import our use global context. and this is coming from our context.jsx. Alright, so now we have imported our context.jsx. Now what we need to do is that we'll be destructuring our data, and if I just look at my context.jsx, we are not in requirement of all this data. We'll just be needing our modal, we'll be needing our close modal method, as well as our questions, and apart from it we'll also be needing our correct. So let's just head back into our modals.jsx and destructure them. So const will be needing our modal, that is going to have the state whether our modal is open or not. Apart from it, close modal, and then again this is the method to close our modal, and after this method we'll be needing correct state and the questions. Now this is going to be equal to use global context. Alright, so now we are having our data. Now we need to assign this data to different divs as well as classes. So now the first place we'll be assigning it is inside our class name. This is going to be a template string, because modals are supposed to open dynamically, right? And as well as we have added different properties for the class name when the modal is open and when the modal is closed. So now after this class name, what we're going to have, just get rid of this modal container is open, and now inside this place a curly braces, now backticks, and inside the backticks we'll be having another sets of curly braces and a dollar sign. So now if our modal is open, that means if our modal is open, so if modal is open, then we want the class name to be assigned as modal container is open. And if this is not the case, that means if modal is not open, then what we want is that then we want modal container to be the class name of this particular div. So now this is the first refactoring that we did. That is, if our modal is open, then we want the class name to be modal container. Modal container is open, and if that's not the case, then we want the class name to be modal container, and that's it. Now apart from it, we'll be wanting to assign a percentage of questions that we have done right. So for that purpose, head to your p tag, and inside the p tag what we're going to do is that get rid of this you answered n questions correctly. Now it is going to have the dynamic value. Now inside a p tag we'll be getting up the percentage of answers that a user has done correct. So you answered, now it is going to take up a percent value, so give it a sets of curly braces, and now again brackets, so correct upon number of questions that are there dot length times 100, right? So again, if this is going to be inside brackets times 100. Now we want it to be fixed to whole numbers. We do not want any sorts of point values after our percentage. We just want the percentage to be like 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80 or 90. We do not want 99.6% or 2.3% like that. So just give it to fixed, and we want it, and we're passing 0 to it because we do not want any sorts of decimal points after it. And after this, put up a percent sign. So it is going to speak out that you answered maybe 30% of questions correctly or 40% of questions correctly, depending upon how many questions have you done correct. Now there's another button that is going to have the onClick property, and this is going to have the functionality to close our modal. So this is going to be assigned our close modal. So now we'll be repeating the pattern what we did earlier. So the first step is to import use global context. So let's do it. Import the use global context. And this is coming from our context, that is up one directory inside of a context, and then the context.jsx. Alright, so we have imported our use global context. Now after this, will be destructuring the data that we need. So inside of our setup form, we just need 4 elements of our context.js, and those are quiz as well as a handle change, because we are having inputs in it, handle change, and apart from handle change, we'll be also needing handle submit, and after handle submit we'll also be getting our error. Alright, now this is going to be equal to use global context. So here is the data that we're getting from our use global context. Now let's assign this data into the various fields. Now the value of our input is going to be equal to quiz.amount. So value is going to be equal to quiz.amount. And after the value, okay, it should be value. The value is going to be equal to quiz.amount, and this is going to have an handle change. So on change property, which is going to be equal to handle change we are getting from our context.jsx. After that, inside of our another div, and that is going to hold the value of category, we'll be assigning it a select option, a value which is going to be equal to quiz.category, and a handle change on change property, which is again going to be equal to handle change. Alright, now let's close this, and after this, inside of our difficulty, the select is going to have an on change property as well, that is going to be equal to handle change, as well as a value property that is going to be equal to quiz dot difficulty. Alright, so here we are having our, apart from handle submit and error, so just come down, and this is the text that we want to render only when there is any sorts of error. So just put it inside curly braces, and what we want is that if our error is true, that means if we are unable to get our data for some reason, then what we want to do is that double ampersand, then we want to display up our paragraph element that is going to say that can't generate questions, please try again. Now we'll be assigning our button that has the text start in it, which is going to be equal to our handle submit. So now we have configured all the values that of our components. We have created a context.jsx, we have passed the data from a context.jsx to our app.jsx, our modal.jsx, and our loading screen is getting active at the point of time when we are loading our data. So everything is perfect now. We'll be taking a look at our application, and let's just take a look at our application whether it's working or not. And if I just click on hit start, okay, I see that it is not working, and if anything goes wrong, then I suspect that context.jsx might not be working properly, because that's the provider component of our application. And the first thing that I suspect is this lookup table. Let's see whether the sports has the corresponding value of 19, or the history has the corresponding value of 23, or the politics has the corresponding value of 24 inside our trivia app. So if I just go out and select category, and in this category I select my sports and click generate API URL. So okay, so this is having the category of 21, so we'll be changing it. So it was a typo, I guess, and this is supposed to have 21. And let's check for history and politics as well. So if I just go back, and now let's check for history, and if I click on generate URL, so yeah, it is 23 for history, and after history we are having our politics. So let's now check for politics. Alright, so yeah, it's 24 now, both of them are fine. So now if you would like to add different categories, so you can just look up at the table and add them into your application, but we have only added 3 of them. Now let's just go back and further dig down in it. Okay, so difficulty is supposed to be easy, not. And after this, okay, our fetch questions is right. It is having a URL, it's getting a response. Now this data needs to be greater than 0. Okay, so if our data.length is greater than 0, that means we are having something inside our array of questions. Then only we want to set our questions, otherwise we don't want to. And apart from it, let's just come down, and here we are having 3 dots. Now let's take a look at them. So it says length does not exist on type number. Now it's because it is not supposed to be length, it is supposed to be questions. So if index is greater than questions dot length minus 1, then we are supposed to do that. Now let's just come down. Okay, so our check answers is right, handle change is perfectly fine, handle submit is fine. Apart from it, just match up the spellings of what you are supplying versus what you are getting or receiving inside your app.js or setup form, and that should be more than sufficient. Now let's just hit save and view our application. So if I now go to my application and maybe give it a hard refresh, hard reload, now let's check whether everything is working fine inside a terminal or not. So everything has been built properly. Now if I just click on start, so here is my quiz and I can select on particular questions, and here I'm getting my answers. And here is my congrats screen that says to me, congratulations, you have answered 20% correctly. Okay, so play again, and here am I at the center of my screen again. So now we have successfully compiled a created application.